Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. We'll begin our service together on page 186. Ode ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Ode ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Ode ani lefanecha Modani lefanecha. However, thanks to you, ever living sovereign, that you have restored my soul to me in mercy, and great is your trust. Matovu, page 192. Matovu Alecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Israel. Matovu Alecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Israel. We'll turn to page 195 and we'll read the second reading down from the top of the page, a blessing for our bodies. Don't let me fall, as a stone falls upon the hard ground. Don't let my hands become dry as the twigs of a tree when the wind beats down the last leaves. And when the storm raises dust from the earth with anger and howling, don't let me fall. I have asked for so much, but as a blade of your grass in a distant wild field, let's drop a seed in the lap of the earth and dies away. Sow in me your living breath, as you sow a seed in the earth. Baruch atah Adonai, rofech kol basar u'mapli la'asot. We'll turn now to page 196, prayer for our souls. Elohai neshama shenatata b'tehorahi. 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 Let's read together on the top of page 197. Matter is never destroyed, only transformed. So too can the soul evolve higher and higher, from instinct to inspiration, haughtiness to holiness, selfishness to service, from individualism to union, to join with the soul of souls, the infinite one. As the soul is magnified and sanctified, so is the infinite one exalted. Baruch atah Adonai asher biado nefesh kol chai v'ruach kol b'sari. We'll turn now to page 198, Nisim B'Cholion, beginning at the top of the page. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan l'safri bina l'avchin ben yom u'ben laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokeh kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rocha haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzadek haver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish harumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten le'ayet koach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavir shina meinai u'tnimaha me'apapai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani b'tzelem Elohim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani ben korim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam osei Yisrael bikuram. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael v'tiyeh parah. Turn now to page 204, and we'll read a blessing for the study of Torah. First the Hebrew at the top, and then the English at the bottom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Adonai our God, let the words of Torah be sweet in our mouths and the mouths of your people Israel, so that we, our descendants and the descendants of all your people Israel, may know you by studying your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to your people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah l'amo Yisrael. Page 206. Elu devarim she'in lahem shiur. שאדם אוכל פירותיהם בעולם הזה, והקרן קיימת לו לעולם הבא, ואלוהים עיבוד אהבה וגמילות חסדים, והשכמת בית המדרש אחרית וערבית, והכנסת אורחים וביקור חולים, והכנסת כלה לוויית המת ועיון תפילה, ואהבת שלום בין אדם לחברו, ותלמוד תורה כנגד כולם. Turn now to page 212 for the opening blessing of Pazukei December. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam baruch hu baruch hoseh v'reshit Baruch Homer ve'Yosef, Baruch Hozer u'Mekayem, Baruch Merachem al haaretz, Baruch Merachem al habriot, Baruch Mishalem Sachar Tov l'Rehav, Baruch Elad v'Kayam lanetzach, Baruch Bodeh u'Matzil, Baruch Shemo. בשבחות ובזמירות נגדלך, ונשבחך נפרך ונזכיר שמך ונמליכך מלכנו אלוהינו, יחיד חיי עולמים, מלך משובח ומפורד עד שמו הגדול, ברוך אתה אדוני, מלך מהולל בתשבחות. Turn now to page 214. מזמור שירה בשבת. טוב להודות לאדוני. טוב להודות לאדוני, ולזמר לשבחה עליון. טוב להודות לאדוני, להגיד בבוקר חסדך, להגיד בבוקר חסדך, ואמונתך בלילות, ואמונתך בלילות, טוב להודות אדוני. עלי אסור ועלי נבל, עלי גיון וכינור, כי שימחתני אדוני בפועלך, ומעשה ידך ענני. מגנו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מגנו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מגנו מעשיך ים, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד יהללוך, עוד יהללוך. אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד יהללוך, עוד יהללוך. סלח, תישא לי אשריך. ואנחנו נברך ים, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה, 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 hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, Psalm 150, page 218. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 el bekocho, hallelujah, bekiamzo, hallelujah, vimorotav, hallelujah, kerokudo, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 ותק השופר, hallelujah, ונבל בכינור, hallelujah, בתוף ומחור, hallelujah, במינים בעוגה, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 tziyat neshama, hallelujah, tziyat neshua, Olam shama, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Nishmat kol echai, tevarech et Shem Adonai Eloheinu. Continue silently on page 219. And on page 220. Ilu finu, malahe shira kayam. Voshoneinu rina kamon galam. Esiptotidu sheba kemarkeve rakia. Ehinenu meirot kashemesh. Vechayareach. Veyadinu krusot kenishrei shamayim. Veragleinu kalot kayalot. Ein אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך. Adonai Eloheinu, Elohei Avotinu, Ve'imotenu, Levarechmeti Salim. Now on page 222, the second paragraph down here. Shochena Aron Kadosh Shemo Echatu Ve'onenu Tzadikim Adonai Yesharim Navatila Ve'pi Yesharim Titalalu divrei tzadikim, Titvarach bilshon hasidim, Titromamu bekerev kedoshim, Titkadashu makehanot, Tivemotam chamet, Israel berina nitpa'an, Shimcha malkeinu bechol Ador Yababai, Yababai, bye bye, bye. Yababai, Yababai, bye bye. Bye 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 bye, bye 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 bye. Aye, aye, bye bye, bye bye, aye, bye bye. We conclude Pesukei Zimra on page 223, and then we roll directly into the Chatzi Kaddish and then the Baruch Hu on the page after. Yishtabach Shimcha Lad Malkeinu, Ha'el HaMelech HaGadol VeHaKadosh B'Shamayim U'Ba'aretz, Yilechadai Adonai Eloheinu Elokei Avotenu V'Imotenu, Shir Shmachal Zimra Zumemshala Netzach, Gedula U'Gvura Tila V'Tiferet Kedusha U'Malchut, Brachot Ve'Hodot Me'ata Ve'Adonam Baruch Atah Adonai El Melech Gadol V'Tishmachot, El Hodot Adonai Miflot Abochem Shirei Zimra Melech El Haolamim Yitkadal V'Yitkadash Shemei Rabba Ve'amad Yiracherte Ve'lich Malchutei V'chaychon V'yamechon V'chayei L'chol Beit Yisrael V'hagala V'zman Kariv V'yimeru Amen. Yesh Mirabba Mevarach Le'olam Ve'amei Almayam Yitarach v'yishtabach v'yipar v'yitrovah v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha v'riku leila minkom birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damirat me'ama v'yimeru Amen. Baruch hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam v'yed. We're now on page 228. We'll read together first in English at the bottom of the page and then the 3 lines in Hebrew just above. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, creator of light and darkness, who makes peace and fashions all things. In mercy you illumine the world and those who live upon it. In your goodness you daily renew creation. Now numerous are your works, Adonai, in wisdom you form them all, filling the earth with your creatures. We praise Adonai, our God, for the excellent work of your hands, and for the lights you created, may they glorify you. Shine a new light upon Zion, that we all may swiftly merit its radiance. Praised are you, Adonai, creator of all heavenly lights. Or Chadash, Al Tzion Ta'ir. Or Chadash, Al Tzion Ta'ir. Venizkechulanu, Meira Le'oru. Venizkechulanu, Meira Le'oru. Yadadaina bim bim bam, yadadaina bim bam, yadadaina bim bim bam, yadadaina yadadaina bim bim bam, yadadaina bim bam, yadadaina bim bim bam, yadadaina Baruch atah Adonai Yotzer HaMe'orot. Turn now to page 230. We'll read together in English at the top of the page and the Hebrew at the bottom. How deeply you have loved us, Adonai, our God, gracing us with surpassing compassion. On account of our forebears whose trust led you to teach the laws of life, be gracious to us, teaching us as well. O merciful one, have mercy on us by making us able to understand, discern, to heed, learn, and teach, and lovingly to observe, perform, and fulfill all that is in your Torah. והעריננו בתורתך ודבק ליבנו במצוותיך ויחל לבבינו לאהבה וליראת שמך ולא נבוש Elohani kalim, Elohani kashem, Le'olam va'ed, Ki b'shem Hodshecha, Hagadol v'anora b'tachnu, Nagila v'nismecha, Nagila v'nismecha v'yeshuatecha. Ve'avienu leshalom, me'arba kanfot haaretz, ve'tolicheinu kol aniyot le'artzenu. Yel poel yeshuot ata ubanu v'chanarta, ve'keravtanu leshimcha, Hagadol Selah be'emet. להודות לך יחדך באהבה, ברוך אתה אדוני, הבוחר בעמו ישראל, באהבה. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. We're on page 234. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברתם בם בשבתך בביתך ולכתך בדרך ובשופך ובקומך, ושרתם לאות על ידיך והיו תותפות בעיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. On page 236. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר בני ישראל ואמרת להם, ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי בידיהם לדורותם, ונתנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת, והיה לכם לציצית, וראיתם אותו, זכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם, אשר אתם זונים אחריהם, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים ללכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם אלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. We're on page 238, about 4 lines up from the bottom in here. Tehillah le'elyon baruch hu mevorach Moshe u'Miriam u'bnei Yisrael lechanu shira b'simcha rabba ve'amru kulam michavocha vaylim Adonai mikavocha Nedar b'kodesh norati lo tosef elem Haylai lai 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 shira chadasha shibku lehulim לשמחה שפת הים יחד כולם הודו והמליכו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד צור ישראל קומה בעזרת ישראל ופדחנו ממך יהודה וישראל בוא עלינו אדוני צבאות שמו קדוש ישראל ברוך אתה אדוני ישראל. We'll begin the Amidah together on page 242, and then we will continue silently. As always, please go at your own pace. Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. So if you're still finishing your Amidah, please continue at your own pace. Those that aren't finished, you can join me on page 324. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Yisrael, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanukah, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Koneh Hakol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot v'Imahot, U'Mevei Geula Livnei B'neihem Leman Shemo B'Yahvah, Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen Baruch Atah Adonai Magen Avraham Ezrat Sarah Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai Mechayei Metim Atarav Le'Oshiach V'Ashiv HaRuach Mo'ed Hashem Mechalkel Chayim B'Chesed Mechayei Metim B'Rachamim Rabim Samech Noflim V'Rofech Olim Umatir Asurim Umekayem Emunato Lishenei Afar Michamocha B'Gevurot Umido Melech Melech Memit Umechayeh Umatzmiach Yeshua V'Nemalat Al Chayot Metim Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayeh HaMetim. Now on page 326. נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב על יד נביאך, וקרא זה אל זה ואמר, קדוש, 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוך כל הארץ כבודו. אדיר, אדירנו, אדוני, אדוננו, מה אדיר שמך בכל הארץ. ברוך כבוד אדוני מקומו. אחד הוא אלוהינו, הוא אבינו מלכנו, הוא מושיענו והוא ישמיענו, ורחמיו לעיני כל חי. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהיך ציון לדור ודור. Hallelujah. Page 328. לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד קוד לך. לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד קוד לך. ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקיש, קדושתך נקיש. ושפחך אלוהינו מפינוי ימוש לעולם לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. Now on page 329, Yismechu at the very top of the page. Yismechu v'malechutech shomrei, 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 Shabbat v'korei, oneg Shabbat. Yismechu v'malechutech shomrei, 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 Shabbat v'korei, oneg Shabbat. Aham mekadshei, מקדשי שירי שבת, כולם ישמחו ויתענגו מטובך שבת. ישמחו במלכותך, שומרי 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 שבת וקורא עונג שבת. והשביעי רצית בו וקידשת שבת. חמלת ימים אותו קראת שבת. ישמחו במלכותך, שומרי 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 שבת וקורא עונג שבת. זכר למעשה בראשית שבת. זכר למעשה בראשית שבת. ישמחו במלכותך, שומרי 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 שבת וקורא עונג שבת. Eloheinu, Eloi Avotenu, V'imotenu, Ritzei, V'imnuchateinu. V'hadeshenu b'mitzvotecha, v'ten chelkeinu b'toratecha, Zahabeinu me'tovecha, v'samecheinu b'shuatecha, v'ta'ed libeinu, le'ovecha b'emet, ve'anchileinu, Adonai Eloheinu, Hai, la 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 la. Yahweh Ratzon Shabbat Kodecha V'Nukuva Yisrael V'Kodshei Shemecha Baruch Atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. Now on page 330, we'll read together in English in the middle of the page. On this Shabbat day, as you graciously receive our prayers, help us to hear your call. Grant us enough help to fulfill our duties and the compassion we need to attend to others. Teach us humility that we may perceive our own faults and grant us the wisdom to be forgiving of others. Give us the courage to be true to our highest selves and the charity to see the best in those around us. Give us patience enough not to become discouraged, hope enough to overcome all fears for the future, faith enough to know your presence. Source of blessing, look with favor upon us. May our offerings be acceptable to you. Baruch atah Adonai, shotcha v'cha v'yanafu. Now on page 332, we'll read together beginning at the bottom of the page. For the expanding grandeur of creation, worlds known and unknown, galaxies beyond galaxies, filling us with awe and challenging our imaginations, Modim anachnu lach. For this fragile planet Earth, its times and tides, its sunsets and seasons, Modim anachnu lach. For the joy of human life, its wonders and surprises, its hopes and achievements, Modim anachnu lach. For human community, our common past and future hope, our oneness transcending all separation, our capacity to work for peace and justice in the midst of hostility and oppression, Modim anachnu lach. For high hopes and noble causes, for faith without fanaticism, for understanding of views not shared, Modim anachnu lach. For all who have labored and suffered for a fairer world, who have lived so that others might live in dignity and freedom, Modim anachnu lach. For human liberties and sacred rights, for opportunities to change and grow, to affirm and choose, Modim anachnu lach. We pray that we may live not by our fears, but by our hopes, not by our words, but by our deeds. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha u'lechana'eh le'odot. We're now on page 334, prayer for peace, much needed. Sim shalom, tova uvracha, ben v'chesed v'rachamim v'rachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol Yisrael amecha, orcheinu yotzreinu kulanu kechad, ve'or panecha, Iver panecha natata lanu, Adonai Eloheinu. Sim shalom, tova uvracha, ben v'chesed v'rachamim v'rachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael amecha, tarat chaim ve'ahavat chesed, ve'ahavat chesed, u'tzedaka uvracha v'rachamim v'chaim v'shalom. Sim shalom, tova uvracha, ben v'chesed v'rachamim v'rachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael amecha, ve'tov einecha lebarech, et amcha Yisrael, v'chol עת ובכל שעה, בשלומך. Sim shalom, tova uvracha, ben v'chesed v'rachamim v'rachamim aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael amecha. Baruch atah Adonai, v'orech et Anu Yisrael, v'shalom. Let's read together on the top of page 337. Prayer is not purely an act. All things pray, and all things pour forth their souls. The heavens pray, the earth prays, every creature and every living thing. In all life there is longing. Creation is itself but a longing, a kind of prayer to the Almighty. What are the clouds, the rising and the setting of the sun, the soft radiance of the moon and the gentleness of the night? What are the flashes of the human mind and the storms of the human heart? They are all prayers, the wordless outpouring of boundless longing for God. Ose shalom Ibrahim, Yase shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. Yase shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yase shalom. Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Israel. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Joan. It's great to be back with all of you and to be studying our next parsha in the book of Vayikra, Parshat Tzav. So Tzav picks up in a lot of ways from where we left off last week, and those that were with us for Torah study, we really began by just trying to take a kind of bird's eye view perspective of this, really intricate, complicated, nuanced, unique system of sacrifices that make up the initial point of connection and worship between the Israelites, our ancestors, and God. And we talked about in pretty good detail, which we'll continue for the next several weeks as we continue with the book, sort of what we as modern people are meant to make of a lot of the things that are being described here. And one of the things that I sort of led off with last week is I'm trying to come into the study of Vayikra this year with a slightly different kind of perspective. I think a lot of times, whether I've intended to or not, it's been something kind of, I don't know whether it's apologetic is the right word for it, but with an obvious discomfort for the conversation and sort of having a hard time articulating how to find meaning amongst all of the what is really, again, rather graphic descriptions in some cases of things that I generally would not normally think of on a Saturday morning or want to think of on a Saturday morning. And I think that last week, as I sort of found with one word in particular that gave me a minute to think differently about an entire concept. This week's portion provides some of that as well. And for this, I want to go actually to my teacher and one of the great teachers I've ever had in my entire life, and somebody who I respect immensely, Rabbi Larry Hoffman. Those that are part of my Friday class will know that we're working through one of his books right now, actually, as we talk about Kabbalat Shabbat. And he was my professor of liturgy at HUC, recently retired. But he's written extensively on a number of different subjects, and he's got a unique eloquence to him. And one that I think things that I respect the most about him is that he doesn't really take anything, I think, for granted. And that when he makes the statements that he makes, which are often bold and sometimes, I wouldn't say controversial, but one in which, one would expect him to receive some pushback for authoritative statements that really may be more opinion. He's always thoroughly researched, and he gives a basis and a background for everything that he's describing, both within the text itself of the Tanakh and of the Talmud, etc., and also within a sense of more contemporary sources. So all of that introduction is a way to begin the conversation. He posted this week, and he's been doing this now for the last couple of years, where he will just sort of pick a topic and write about it and post it on his Facebook page. And the title of this sort of group of writings is Letters to My Students. So he, in essence, is sort of, now that he is free of his responsibilities at HUC, he's taking the time to do what a person like him, does naturally, which is to coalesce these ideas that he's been carrying around for years and trying to leave them as some kind of, sense of who he is and who he is in terms of his understanding of all of the nuanced brilliance of Judaism and its complexities. So again, long preamble to his teaching, but it's important to sort of, know in our tradition, it's important to know where our teaching comes from and who it is that it's coming from. And especially when it's something where I can give some personal insight to it because of experiences that I've had with him, I think all the more poignant for me as one of his students. So he wrote this letter, and he titles it "More on Sin, Not Original but Primal." So he's going to pick up on one of the, as we talked about last week as a sort of introduction, that there are different sacrifices for different purposes. And that one of the very significant ones is a offering that is given in expiation for sin, for something that is done wrong, which in Hebrew is referred to as the chatat offering. The chet is generally, almost universally translated as sin, as you will find it in most translations, both in the liturgy and in the commentaries. And if you think about one of our common Yom Kippur prayers, Al Chet, right? Al Chet shechatanu lefanecha, part of the Vidui, right? This idea is that we have sinned, okay? But he'll point out something that I am actually a part of, and I didn't even realize, right? I've been teaching here for many years, and he challenges a common conception and pushes back on something which I think is really quite important and quite brilliant. So here's where he begins. He says, I'm intrigued by the number of people who have commented on my use of the word, quote unquote, sin. My friend and colleague, Rabbi Linda Henry Goodman, who herself is a remarkable rabbi, is particularly eloquent when she recalls. So this is a letter that she wrote to him. And she says, I, and I'm sure so many of our colleagues, have worked so hard over the years to explain to our people, and especially to our kids, that for Jews, sin is not an inherent state of being, but rather, quote, a missing of the mark. What we do, not what we are. But as we all know, there have been individuals in human history who can only be characterized by the most primitive impulses within them. Raw, horrifying evil. I am viscerally uncomfortable even using that vocabulary because it smacks of fundamentalist preachers and hellfire and brimstone. So in this case, right, Rabbi Goodman is basically saying what I've actually taught many times, and certainly to the kids in our Hebrew school, especially around Yom Kippur, that this idea of chet is actually something different, that we don't really think of it as sin as we tend to think about the word sin in other contexts. Okay, so he continues and he explains a little bit further. So this is now Hoffman speaking. Rabbi Goodman speaks for many. I too was taught that for Jews, sin is, quote, missing the mark. This, he says, is a claim that relies on biblical passages such as Judges 20:16, where we read about a Benjaminite army with 700 people who could, quote, sling a stone at a hare and not miss the mark. Chata, the Hebrew word for miss the mark, is related to chet, the word for sin, as well. In other words, they share the same basic root. So this missing the mark word, right, velo chata, is of the same exact root as this word chet, which we translate again as sin. So here's where Hoffman pushes back, right? And as I said, this is something that I've taught many times, and I still appreciate the concept of it, that at least there is a related word, that's about missing the mark. However, Hoffman pushes back a little bit. He says, to conclude, however, that Judaism identifies sin merely as missing the mark is just plain wrong. To start with, the Torah has other terms for sin that don't mean that at all. And as Mark Brettler has written one of the authoritative books on Torah commentary and on biblical Hebrew in particular, points out, any given biblical word for sin may indeed have its own metaphorical resonance. Quote, but once the words are formed, they take on their own meanings, not necessarily related to their metaphoric origins. It is a mistake, therefore, the etymological fallacy, as it is known, to think we know what a word means just because we know what some version of it means originally. Finally, Jews today are by no means biblical anyway. So in other words, he basically says that there is a danger in what we often do, and actually is a very common rabbinic practice, which is making equations between words based on a core root structure. In other words, saying that this word means this word because they share the same root. When in reality, that's not how a root system works in a language like Hebrew. The root is essentially very, very important. It holds everything together. But how you then conjugate that root can drastically change what the word actually means in its context. And as Brettler points out, that once a word is being used in its context for long enough, it often goes beyond whatever its original poetic intention might have been, or its metaphoric intention, and it becomes something else entirely. A classic but absurd example of this is how people now use the word literal when they're referring to something that is figurative. right? But it's become so prevalent now as a practice that even dictionaries now list under the definition, right, of literal, the usage of it as improperly as figurative. So the same idea is true in a different kind of context here, where words, whatever their original intention may have been, can also change over time depending on the context and how they are used. So he then explains a little bit about how it is that all of us started teaching about this idea of missing the mark. And he points out that this actually has a historical basis really here in the United States, and that it largely has to do, from a period of time where his professors, so this would be, people who were basically trained in the 30s and the 40s, who then became the professors of Hoffman's generation, who taught this original kind of idea. They were largely trying to distance Judaism from the sort of fire and brimstone, as Rabbi Goodman points out, Bible thumping preacher version of sin, and in particular the idea of original sin, which is something that is crafted out of, if I remember correctly, it's crafted out of the teachings of Paul, but it gets attributed many generations later to somebody else who writes about it. But this idea that basically, the sin in the Garden of Eden is a perpetual stain or taint on human beings, and that we are all born inherently stained by this taint of our ancestors going back to Adam and Eve. And therefore, our job is to sort of counterbalance that inherent taint, so to speak. And that taint generally is considered to be the word sin. So he's trying to just draw, again, a distinction about this. He points out that on a TV program, this is going back to Hoffman, introducing the high holidays in the 1970s, a prominent psychiatrist at the time, with whom I was in dialogue, urged me to give up the word sin on the grounds that it smacked of, indeed, religious fundamentalism. Our teachers were doing just that, effectively eliminating sin from our theological vocabulary by demoting it to a human error in judgment, an attempt to do better, but missing the mark. Here was a view that was compatible with humanistic psychology, while also a demonstration contrary to, the more prevalent usage of it outside of Judaism, to understand that the sin is not as it is implied to be this original sin concept. And so Hoffman responded to the psychiatrist then, and as he says, he believes even stronger today, that regardless of the psychological explanations for human evil, we still need a word to underscore the especially repugnant nature of at least the most hideous of those acts. And I think the time-honored word sin does just that. In other words, he's saying that if we eliminate sin from, as he calls it, our theological vocabulary, and we focus on this word chet and make it into only about missing the mark, right? Good intentions, or even not ill intentions, and just being off, okay? We take away the capacity to have a word that actually describes something truly, truly awful. Okay, the time-honored word, he said, sin does just that. And so, as he says to conclude, right, even if sin is not original, right, this idea, again, and generally speaking, sort of preacher-led idea of original sin tying to the Garden of Eden, even if sin is not original, he says it can be primal. This is Hoffman. Not a permanent part of our DNA, right, not a taint, but a primal mode of behavior to which some people, some of the time, actually do sink. And he closes with what is powerful and obvious, right? Putin's brutal and wholesale murdering of civilians is no mere missing the mark, it is sin. Okay? And, for somebody like myself who really tries very hard to embody this idea of rachamim, right? This element of God's compassion that we as human beings attempt to emulate, right? It's hard for me to really put things into categories that are so extreme as to be beyond forgiveness, right? Beyond the capacity for growth. And I've always felt so much more comfortable with this idea of, missing the mark, as it were, as opposed to this idea of sin. But I think Hoffman is legitimately correct here, that there is always a danger of sanitizing or making ourselves so comfortable that we're not challenged anymore to think about what this really being discussed here, right? Now, to be fair and to push back a little bit on Hoffman, as we'll look in our Torah portion, as we'll see, the Chatat offering was not offered, generally speaking, for things like, irreversible evils like murder or mass murder, things of that nature, right? A Chatat offering could be offered for simple things that are done wrong. But I don't think that it's fair to suggest that that's only the category either. I think really what Hoffman is saying is that it's not that sin should be the only way of thinking about a chatat offering, right? The missing the mark concept exists there as well. But we have to sort of be able to have space for both of these elements. And that a chatat is really meant, really on its basic level, as a violation of God's law in some form or the other. And God's law can include everything from the most extreme, as I said, of taking life, to the least extreme of shatnez, of mixing, two different kinds of materials in your clothing. Okay, so one of those things, right? If you're not scrupulous in checking your clothes, okay, so that's a missing the mark kind of example, right? You weren't so nice to your parents, okay, that's a missing the mark kind of example. But when you are doing the kind of things that we are seeing happen right now in Ukraine, there really isn't any other word for this. These are sins. These are affronts to God in the deepest possible sense. And truly ones that I think actually would be beyond what any kind of sacrifice or worship of any sort will ultimately be able to expunge. So with that, it's a complicated, thinking for all of this, but I just was really struck by the honesty of what he was ultimately teaching this morning. And we'll discuss everything a little bit more in Torah study for those that are able to join us. So with that, I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and we're going to begin our Torah service together in our Sidurim on page 362. אין כמוך אלוהים אדוני ואין כמעשך מלכותך מלכות כל העולמים וממשלתך בכל דור ודור אדוני מלך אדוני מלך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד אדוני עוז לא ייתן אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום Abba Harachamim, Ekhiva Virtzoncha, Et Zion, Tivnei Chomot Yerushalayim, Ki Bechad Levad Batachnu, Melech Elam Melisa, Adon Olamim, Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, u'devar Adonai miYerushalayim. Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah. Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah. Le'amo Yisrael v'kedushato. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. Gadol Adonai Tiyodeh Olema, Shemo Yachdav. Echa Adonai Hagedu Kudah. והגבורה והתפארת והנצח וההוד יכו בשמיים ובארץ יכו בשמיים ובארץ לך אדוני הממלכה והמתנשא לכל Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. As I said, reading this morning from Parshat Tzav, we're going to read the first Aliyah together, page 595 in the Torah, a Women's Commentary. Again, page 595, the Torah, a Women's Commentary. And, oops, sorry, I was looking elsewhere. On page 688, if you're in the Cloud Chumash, again 688 in the Cloud Chumash, 595 in the Women's Torah Commentary. Also, just pointing out, if you do have a Women's Commentary, very helpful, page 594. As always, each Parsha has a wonderful outline describing all the various elements of the Parsha itself. So I will be reading the first 11 verses, which constitutes the first Aliyah, in just a moment. And again, those are the first 11 verses of chapter 6 in the book of Vayikra. So let me just share screen so we can all be looking. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, צב את אהרון ואת בניו לאמור, זאת תורת העולם, היא העולם על מוקדל המזבח כל הלילה עד הבוקר, אש המזבח תוקד בו. רש הכהן מדובד, ומכתסי בד ילבש על בשרו, והרים את הדשן, אשר תאכל האש, על העולה על המזבח, ושמו אצל המזבח. ופשט את בגדיו ולבש בגדים אחרים, והוציא את הדשן אל מחוץ למחנה אל מקום טהור, והאש על המזבח תוקד בו לא תכבה, וירא עליה הכהן עצים בבוקר וערך עליה העולה, והקטיר עליה חלבי השלמים. אש תמיד תוקד על המזבח לא תכבה, וזאת תורת המנחה. הקרב אותה בני אהרון לפני אדוני אל פני המזבח, ויהי ממנו בקבוצו, מסול את המנחה ומשמה, ואת כל הלונה אשר על המנחה, והקטיר המזבח ירח ניחוח, אז כתב אדוני. והנותרת ממנה יאכלו אהרון ובניו מצות תאכל במקום קדוש, וחצר אל מועד יאכלוה. לא תאפה חמץ חלקם, נתתי אותה אישה קודש קודשים היא, כחטאת וכאשם. כל זכר מבני אהרון יאכלנה, כל לדורותיכם מאישי אדוני, כל אשר ייגע בכם יקש. Okay, so we've finished our Torah reading for this morning, but we'll now turn back in our prayer books to page 371 as we offer our Misha Berach this morning. And of course, as we've been doing the last several weeks, and we'll continue to do so, in addition to the people that we know and are directly connected to, we extend our hearts and our prayers to our brothers and sisters, in both in literal and figurative sense in Ukraine, and those that have fled and are now dispersing all over the world. We do our very best, certainly to support them, but also to pray for healing of the country and healing of the world. So in our community this Shabbat, we are thinking of Debbie Block-Kroll, Gail Gambino, Brad Friedman, Mike Klinghoffer, Chaim Ben Yosef Bechava, Norma Polsek, Dina Batchana, Benzi Tepper, Cecilia Hirsch, Glenn Tinney, Tzipora Hava, Gittel Bachmuel Ben Viva, Bruce Steger, Chana Ruth Batzara, Jeff Baker, David Tasher, Jim Cohn, Monique Rathman, Lindsay Epstein, Dolores Michka, Sylvia Oren, Yerachmiel Ben Hinda, Paloma Chauhan, Samuel Moskowitz, Chaim Leib, Joyce Weinberg, Stu Pollack, Jane London, Catherine Guarino, Judy Stern, Miriam Cornfield, Raz Brody, Chana Ruth Batzara, Bagel Tzipora Bat Elisheva Batzara, Richard Gambino, Michelle Sawicki, Adabasha Ben Yitzchak, Tzvi Menachem Chaim, Rivka Bat Devora, Amy and Gavin Tucker, James Kurz, David Dowling, Israel Ben Yitzchak, Lorraine Danis, Buddy Kasov, Shelley Newmark, David Kyle Klopman, Rivka Ben Rachel, Sarah Ben Chana, Moshe Eliezer Ben Sivia, Peretz Ben Yehuda, Leah Ben Naomi, Gedalia Ben Leah, Justin Banner, Tzipora, Ahava Bat Yehudit Rachel, Jane Beard Cass, Amy Cass, Steve Levine, Ephraim Raphael Ben Esther, and Myra Maslin. And of course, we'll invite Joan, if you'd like to add any names in the chat, those that are watching at home, you can say the names of your loved ones as well. הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם לחלימם ולרבותם לחזיקם וישלח להם מהרה רפואה שלמה מן השמיים, רפואת הנפש, רפואת הגוף, השתה בגלה בזמן קריב, ונאמר אמן. May the one who blessed our ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those who are suffering. May the blessed and Holy One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored and their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send them a complete renewal of body and spirit, and let us say together, Amen. So we'll turn now to our Haftarah for this morning, which, one second. And our Plat Chumash can be found on page 701. If you're following in another form, you're looking for the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 7, verses 21 to 8, chapter 3, verse. I always get confused by this. Okay, it's chapter 7, verse 21 to chapter 8, verse 3, and then chapter 9, verses 22 to 23. This is one of those examples, as we've talked about, in which you have to write sometimes if the general order of things, right, if we were ending in the third verse of chapter 8, is not exactly the best or most positive light. So we'll add what's generally called as an achemta, a positive ending on from a different section, a slightly further on in the story, is this case from chapter 9. So just interesting how things can work sometimes differently in the Haftarahs than it can in the Torah portion. But even in Torah portion, the way that aliyot are broken up is you're meant to avoid as much as possible ending on anything that is conceived to be negative. Can end on something that's parv, sort of neither positive nor negative, but not ending on something negative. So that word nechemta is part of this word nachum, which really means, the root itself, nun chet mem, is Hoffman. Sorry, no, chetmem, is about resting and causing rest. So before we get to our Haftarah, we'll offer our blessings. It's back in our prayer books if you'd like to follow along, page 372. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nbiim tovim v'ratzav v'divreihem v'nemarim emet. Baruch atah Adonai ocher b'torah v'moshe avdo u'Yisrael amo v'yeh haemet v'tzedek. Thus says the God of heaven's hosts, the God of Israel. Add your whole burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat. But when I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I neither spoke to them nor commanded them about burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this is the command I gave. Listen to me, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. Walk only in the way that I have commanded you, and it shall go well with you. But they neither listened nor paid heed. In the stubbornness of their evil hearts, they walked in their own counsels. They went backward instead of forward. From the day your ancestors left the land of Egypt to this day, I have been sending you my servants, the prophets, sending them day in and day out. But they would not listen to me. They paid no heed, they stiffened their necks, and did even worse than did their ancestors. When you speak all these words to them, they shall not listen. When you call to them, they shall not answer. And therefore say to them, here is the nation that would not listen to the voice of the eternal their God, that would not accept instruction. Faithfulness is lost, banished from their mouths. Cut off your locks, throw them away, and on the heights raise your voice in lamentation. The Eternal has rejected and abandoned the generation that provoked God's wrath. The people of Judah have done what is evil in my sight, says the Eternal One. They have placed their idols in the house that bears my name and defiled it. They have built the shrine of Tophet in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters by burning, something I never commanded them to do, something that never entered my mind. Therefore, says the Eternal One, the days are coming when this place will no longer be called Tophet or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. They shall bury in Tophet till no room remains. The bodies of this people will be food for birds and beasts. There will be no one to frighten them away. And in the towns of Judah and the streets of Yerushalayim, I will silence the sounds of joy and the sounds of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land shall be a ruin. At that time, says the Eternal One, the bones of the kings of Judah, the leaders, priests, prophets, and all the people of Yerushalayim shall be taken out of their graves. They shall be spread out under the sun, moon, and the hosts of heaven, which they loved and served, which they followed and consulted and worshipped. Instead of being gathered up and buried, they shall be dung, fertilizing the ground. And the remnant that remains of this evil folk and all the remaining places to which I have driven them will prefer death to life, says the God of heaven's hosts. Thus says the Eternal One, let not the wise glory in their wisdom, let not the mighty glory in their might, let not the rich glory in their riches, but let them who glory in this, that they understand and know me, that I, the Eternal, practice kindness, justice, and righteousness in the earth, for in these things do I delight, says the Eternal. So this is really a very powerful Haftarah. Jeremiah, again, just as a reminder, is the prophet that oversees not oversees. He watches the destruction of Yerushalayim with his own eyes. So he's the most lamenting of all of the prophets, as we discussed in my Heschel class. It should also be pointed out very interestingly in verses 34 and I think just verse 34. So for those that have experienced a Jewish wedding before, as I imagine most of you have, right? One of the Sheva Brachot, one of the 7 blessings that oftentimes people join in and start saying is Kol Sason V'Kol Simcha Kol Chatan V'Kol Chala. Right? Turns out that melody was written by a friend of ours, which I just didn't sing so well. But it comes in essence from here. Interestingly enough, though, in our Haftarah is being described in a negative fashion. Right, that when things go bad, these sounds, the sounds of joy and sounds of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, right, that these things will disappear, right? So all the more interesting that when it comes to the Sheva Brachot, we are praying in essence that one of those brachot is about the return of these positive things to Yerushalayim, right? And that's one of the things a wedding symbolizes and is why it is so important to celebrate them with such joy. So fascinating Haftarah, which maybe we'll get into a little bit in our Torah study. We'll turn back to our prayer books now, page 372 at the bottom, to do the blessing after the Haftarah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol olamim, tzadik b'chol dorot, ha'el ha'ne'eman ha'omer v'yoseh, ha'medaber m'chayim, shekol devarav emet v'tzedek, al ha'torah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al hayom ha'shabbat hazeh, שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה לכבוד ולתפארת על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך יברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת אמן. Okay, we'll turn now to page 374, the very top of the page. Actually 376, a prayer for our country, and then a prayer for the state of Israel. O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace, and may we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. Amen. Prayer for the state of Israel, page 377. Avinu Shabashamayim Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reishit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Magen aleha ve'avrat chastecha, ufros aleh sukat shlomecha. ושלח אורך ועמיתך לראשיה, שריה ויועציה. ותקנם בעצה טובה מלפניך, ונתת שלום בארץ, ושמחת עולם ליושביה, ונאמר, Amen. O Heavenly One, Protector and Redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love, spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Amen. Turn to page 374 as we conclude the Torah service beginning at the top of the page. Ya'alelu et Shem Adonai, ki nizkav shemo levado, kodo al eretz v'shamayim, v'yarem keren li'amu, tehila lechol chasidav, livnei Yisrael am keroho. Hallelujah, hallelujah. כי לכך טוב נתתי לכם, תורתי אל תעזובו. את חיים היא למאחזים בה, וטוב לכך, מאושר דרכיה, דרכי נועם, וכל נתיבותיה שלום. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה. קדש, קדש ימינו, קדש ימינו כקדם. Turn now to page 586 at the bottom. Aleinu l'shabech. Aleinu l'shabech l'adon hakol, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגור עלינו ככל אמונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. Now page 591. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד. Now invite those in mourning and those observing yahrzeit to join me on page 598. And before we recite the mourner's Kaddish together, we want to acknowledge those who have passed away in our community in recent months. Dr. John Abdrakin, Faith Diskin, Linda Danoff, Arlene Eber, Jay Fagan, Ellen Frank, Evelyn Geld, Chaim Bear Greenwald, Arthur Grossman, Gerald Hirsch, Mark Joseph, Gertrude Katz, Deirdre Klein, Leo Leibowitz, William Littman, Audrey Lubo, Morty Lynn, Jerry Monroe, Nancy Nagel, Harry Olstein, Geraldine Rosen, Harriet Roth, Jeannie Rubin, Howard Schreier, David Sent, Marlise Silverberg, Blanche Sklar, Rita Snyder, Joan Strunk Tanzilius, and Matthew Adams Zimmerman. Also mark the yahrzeits that occurred during the last week for Len Barron, Murray Bergman, Sally Burke, Arlene Eber, Herman Epstein, Harry Fleischer, Lee Goldstein, Isidore Harkabay, and Mel Hart, Don Katz, Louis Leonard, Rita Margaretin, Pearl Meyerson, Joseph Moskowitz, Kiki Riskin, Henrietta Sanborn, Gussie Schenker, Geraldine Scholl, Marley Taylor, Michael Warner, Carol Wechter, and Arthur Weiss. If you have additional names to share that we didn't mention, you're welcome to mention them out loud at home, and I'll invite the mourners to join me on page 598. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ועלמא דיברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, וחייכונו וימלכונו בחיי דכל בית ישראל, ועגלה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילם עם כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום הרבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו amen. Zichronam libracha, may every one of their memories be for a blessing. Hey, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So I somehow between last night and tonight ended up misplacing my notes, my announcements. But one thing I neglected to mention, I apologize, I had every intention to do it. I spoke about it at great length last night, so if you missed the service, you can go back and watch the sermon with a whole lot more detail. But as it happens, this Shabbat is the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah to take place, probably really accurately in the entire world, but certainly here in America. It was Mordechai Kaplan's daughter Judith in 1922. So again, 100 years. And as I talked about last night, while that first bat mitzvah was the furthest thing from what we today hope for in the bat mitzvah experience of our students here at the temple, which are fully equal in every conceivable way with those of their male counterparts, and for those of genders that are in between or both, that anyone who would ever have a bar B bat mitzvah here at the temple should always feel, of equitable and equality, in every action that we take. But in her case, was not equal to the males of her time, and it took, in fact, many decades before we got to a point in which it resembled that, let alone, embodied those best qualities. But it's a remarkable thing up from 100 years. And I've been particularly moved in that colleagues of mine, female colleagues of mine, have been posting for this Shabbat pictures of themselves at their bat mitzvah and talking about the experience really in very personal terms. So if you happen to be friends with any female rabbis on Facebook, go check out their web pages. I can almost, or their Facebook pages. I can almost guarantee you that there is something posted there. And I think it's going to take some time for me to go back and read every single one of them. But I think it's something that is really very much from the heart, and a realization that things are still a long way from where they need to be. But where we have come from in 100 years, and what the future of Judaism looks like because of the courageous acts of the women, especially at the and really actually accurately, girls, the 12 and 13-year-old girls who really were the ones who pushed for these experiences, that courage early on to persevere through a lot of very strong headwinds is the reason why we can have the experiences that our younger students have. And then on top of it, also, as I said last night, some of the most meaningful experiences I've had as a rabbi were helping and officiating for adult bat mitzvah for people who either had something that was unsatisfying earlier in their life or no opportunity at all. And we've had several really remarkable women come in and experience that and be celebrated for their ability to connect with and then to teach Torah. So, just make sure that you spend some time this weekend, if you can, on the Jewish Women's Archive. There was a great All Things Considered on NPR about this. Just the numerous articles, really brilliant rabbis writing about this. Spend some time this weekend and really, dive into that history. And I'm sorry, I meant to mention it during the Torah study itself. I'm just, I was woken up very early this morning. I'm not quite awake yet. So in any case, I forgot, as I said, where I put the announcement sheet. So my best advice is please check your e-blast, check the website. If you don't know Eileen, certainly I can tell you. And also to join us for Torah study on Zoom at 12 o'clock. That would be great. And just an early pitch for Women's Torah Commentary in April is going to be taught by Cantor Lauren. So that's something that you want to put on your radars and not to miss. Beyond that, I also just want to wish Ruth Joseph and her wonderful family a Mazal Tov on the birth of a wonderful grandchild, a grandson. And we're waiting to hear names and details and all those good things. But Ruth, we wish you and your wonderful family all the best in this wonderful news. I'm sure you're beaming from side to side. So with that, we'll end our service with Ein Keloheinu, page 626. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadoneinu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Mi Keloheinu, Mi Kadoneinu, Mi Kemalkeinu, Mi Kemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adoneinu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adoneinu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adoneinu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu. We'll turn back to page 604 for Kiddush. If you have Kiddush cup handy, you are welcome to join. Veshamru bnei Israel et haShabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. על כן ברך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו ספרים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. Okay. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Shabbat shalom to Joan, who's on the Zoom with me. And I will see you for Torah study at 12 o'clock.